Hello, I am Xarkun, and this is World of Warships Legends. Today I've got a look at the new Premium Tier 7 Russian cruiser Ochakov for you. This is the campaign reward ship for the ongoing campaign. Gonna take a look at my commander build, mod selection, the armor viewer, and then jump into some gameplay and talk about the stats. Commander, Nikolai Kuznetsov. Not much to say about this build, except that I am running Equilibrium of Power, and you might not need to with this ship. Talk about that once we get into the video. Mod selection, got Aiming Systems Mod 1, Steering Gears, Concealment, and Main Battery Reload Mod in the 4th slot. Now, onto the Armor Viewer. You can see that basically this entire ship is coated in green 26mm plating, which means it can be overmatched by battleships with 15 and 16-inch guns, although the deck armor can bounce fire from 15-inch guns for whatever that's worth. The Citadel, kind of exposed out of the water, but not as terribly exposed as some Tier 7 cruisers are. So, the Citadel is also pretty narrow. It's possible that battleships shooting at the broadside of this thing will find themselves getting mostly over penetrations, a lot of the time at least, but not all of the time. Now on to the gameplay. We've got a match on Fault Line. It is Capture the Base mode, and we will begin, as always, by talking about the Ochakov's stats. 34,730 hit points, which I think puts it at the lowest hit points pool at Tier 7 in terms of cruisers by a couple of thousand of hit points, and no torpedo damage reduction whatsoever. So you don't want to be taking torpedoes in this cruiser, particularly Yudachi torpedoes. Now on to the guns. It's got 8 of them, 152mm in 4x2 turrets. Pretty much every Tier 7 cruiser except Hipper and Prinz Eugen have more guns, including the 2 Tier 7 Russian cruisers Chapayev and Kutuzov, and this I think is significant. Like the Chapayev and Kutuzov though, these guns have long range, 18.3 kilometers on my build with the appropriate flag, and they have a 4.9 second reload on my build, which is great. It's faster than both the Chapayev and Kutuzov, at least on my builds, and it's basically on par with the Tier 7 American tech tree cruiser Cleveland. 15.9 second turret traverse on these guns, not terribly slow. And then the base stats for the... Actually, you know what? Hold on before we talk about those stats. I am spotted. Nothing is in view, so pop the radar. It is a Yudachi, 6 kilometers away. The Ochakov has radar. It lasts for a little bit over 15 seconds and has a very long range. I think 11, maybe even 12 kilometers. It's the typical Russian radar with a short duration and long range. Great for detecting destroyers, albeit for a limited amount of time. And even though we did not manage to sink that Yudachi, we have made it much more complicated for him to play his game. Now, as far as the shells we used to shoot at the Yudachi, base stats on the HE, 2200 max damage with a 17% fire chance. But as I said, I am running Equilibrium of Power, which means the maximum damage is reduced to 1,760, and the fire chance is reduced to 7.6%. Now, these are typical Russian cruiser numbers with EOP applied. However, the Ochakov does not have the same 1/6 penetration values for its high explosive shells as most cruisers do. In other words, you take the total gun caliber, 152 millimeters in this case, and divide by 6, and then that gives you the armor value that the high explosive can penetrate. However, on the Ochakov, it gets quarter penetration. So you take the 152 and divide by 5, meaning that without the equilibrium of power skill, most 152mm cruisers can only penetrate 25mm of armor, but the Ochakov can penetrate 30mm of armor. So if you want high explosive shells that do damage to more heavily armored targets without using EOP, you can get that on the Ochakov. Now, of course, it won't penetrate 32mm of armor, and that is an important value because a lot of battleships at Tier 7 have 32mm of armor plating pretty much everywhere. But at the same time, a lot of cruisers, or at least some cruisers at Tier 7, maybe one in particular, has 30mm of armor plating, and then there are a few with 27. Now, normally, without equilibrium of power, the high explosive shells from 152mm guns would not be able to penetrate the 30mm of armor found on something like the Edinburgh, or the 27 found on something like the Baltimore, Wichita, Hipper, Eugen, etc. But the Ochakov's HE can pen those values without equilibrium of power, and so if you want to go without equilibrium of power, your HE shells will be able to do more damage. They'll be a little bit less effective against most battleships, but they will still enjoy a great 17% fire chance shooting shells every less than 5 seconds. So that is interesting. That does make it a little bit more powerful. The AP shells do a maximum of 3,500 max damage, and they are quite effective, thanks in large part due to the flat trajectories of the shells when you fire them. It's the same characteristics that the Ochakov shares with other Russian cruisers, Russian battleships, and Russian destroyers. The shells are very high velocity and easy to aim at distance. The Ochakov also has torpedoes, 10 of them actually, in 2 quintuple launchers on either side of the ships. That is more torpedoes than either the Kutuzov or Chapayev. They do have a long reload, 131 seconds, and they do a maximum of 15,100 damage, which is typical for Russian torpedoes. 8-kilometer range makes them more usable than the torpedoes on something like the Chapayev, and 65 knot speed is actually quite good for a cruiser. The maneuverability characteristics of the Ochakov, 36 knots in the water with this speed flag on. I think even without that, it is basically the second best at the tier, behind the excellent Amalfi. 750-meter turning circle, which is large for a cruiser, and 6-second rudder shift, which is actually quite good. Finally, the detectability of the Ochakov with my build here, 11.2 kilometers by sea, which, it's pretty visible. And concealment isn't really one of the strong suits of these Russian cruisers. And after all, why would you really need it if your guns can shoot out past 18 kilometers? You can safely stay in the back. As far as how does this ship play? Well, both of the other Tier 7 Russian cruisers, Chapayev on the tech tree and Kutuzov for the premium, have 12 152mm guns. So this only has 8. And I feel like that is a significant difference in terms of DPM, despite the fact that the Ochakov fires faster than either of those cruisers. The lack of guns makes the firepower a little bit more anemic. And I'm not saying this is a bad ship or an ineffective one. It's not. It is an effective ship. It's a good ship, I would say. However, I'm not sure what role it's supposed to fill or what kind of different flavor it's supposed to give you from something like the Chapayev or the Kutuzov. Of course, the Chapayev has radar, much like the Ochakov, and the radars are very comparable between the two ships. And then the Kutuzov does not have radar, but it does have a smoke screen. So essentially, this Ochakov feels a little bit like a Chapayev with less armor, less hit points, and less guns, albeit it fires a little bit faster, and the high explosive shells have better penetration values without equilibrium of power. These are, I guess in the grand scheme of things, minor differences, and basically this ship sort of feels like more of the same. That doesn't mean it's a bad ship, it's not. It just means it's an okay ship. Suppose that you take this thing into a fight with something like the Cleveland, and you're one-on-one with the Cleveland. You actually have a few less hit points than the Cleveland. You fire at about the same rate, but you have fewer guns. So I would expect that a Cleveland would out DPM this thing and probably win a DPM contest one-on-one because of the lack of guns. I don't think the same would be true of the Chapayev or the Kutuzov, because both of them have more hit points than the Cleveland, and even though they fire at a slower rate, they do have, like I said, more hit points, and they have more guns than the Ochakov, so I think the fight would be more even. Basically, I think the lack of guns is a little bit of an issue on the Ochakov, which makes it less effective than it might otherwise be. Again, that's not to say it is a bad ship. It's very much a ship in the vein of Kutuzov and Chapayev. It's just a little bit different. And to be totally honest, I don't particularly care for this Russian cruiser playstyle, where you're most effective at long ranges spamming high explosive at targets. Although, I did say the armor piercing is effective, and you could see there, we got 3,300 damage off of that broadside Nelson with the AP. If you've got anything showing broadside to you in this ship, you can go ahead and switch to that armor piercing, and you'll find that the damage that you do with that is actually quite excellent. So, there is that. But essentially, this is the typical long-range, HE spamming sniper Russian cruiser playstyle. Not my favorite thing, although it is a very effective ship with a high rate of fire. Very effective. I mean, very effective relatively. I think certain other ships like the Cleveland are more effective than this ship. But, you know, if you like the Chapayev and you like the Kutuzov, then you're probably going to enjoy this ship quite a lot, and you're going to want to get the Admiralty backing to finish out the campaign and acquire this ship. It can be a lot of fun to play if you enjoy playing cruisers and you like the Russian cruiser playstyle. The only thing is the lack of armor does make it vulnerable to battleships, but at the same time, it's so poorly armored that if battleships are shooting armor piercing at you, you can display flat broadside to them and hope that their armor piercing shells will overpenetrate, sort of like you can in the Tier 6 premium American cruiser Atlanta. Of course, when you do that, you are playing Russian roulette. You might come out of an engagement with a battleship shooting AP at your broadside alive, having only taken over-penetration damage, or you might be citadeled and you might be deleted. It's not something you want to rely on, but the lack of armor does make it possible, and the lack of armor is going to make it frustrating for some battleships to shoot at you in attempts to deal damage, if they can even hit you, because, you know, you can be so far away from them, and the ship is quite fast and fairly maneuverable. Alas, this game is about to end, so closing thoughts on the Ochakov. It's okay. It's pretty good, honestly. Not my cup of tea. I think there are some better Tier 7 cruisers, but, you know, if you like this playstyle, definitely get the Admiralty backing and grind out the campaign. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.